Okay.
Yep.
Good evening, everyone. This is Ray Douglas, Safeguidance TV, and today we have a amazing session ready for everyone, from racism to radicalization, and we've got Dave Alport here. So Dave Alport is the co-founder of a program called Me and You Education, but also a founder of Rewind, which is based in the West Midlands, which has received national and international recognition around their anti-racism, anti-hate, anti-radicalization work. Dave himself has over 30 years experience in anti-racism work, so that's a lot of years, working with groups, communities, and individuals who have unfortunately fallen into radical behavior. So I'd like to welcome you, Dave.
Okay, thanks, Ray. Thank you.
And also, yeah, you can, but also let's not lose, you know, as one youth worker to another. That's your background, right? Youth work, and then you went on to do a master's in community studies.
That's right.
Excellent, excellent. So thank you for coming on Safeguidance TV today.
You're welcome.
So yeah, feel free. So give us a bit of background about Rewind, first of all. What was it born out of?
It was born out of, well, my history. For 17 years, I worked in heavy industry in a foundry. Hadn't got a clue about youth work or anything such like that. But I worked for about 7 years at an African Caribbean resource centre. And that's when I sort of became interested in, should we say, some of the issues, because some of the kids would come to that youth centre. We used to run a Saturday supplementary school. It's still actually running now. And some of the kids would come in, and the parents, with some pretty horrific tales of how their kids had been treated in education at the time. You know, and it's going back a good few years, but, you know, it was pretty horrific. Some of it was just ignorance, and some of it I can only describe as, you know, systemic racism and nothing less than that, to be fair. And that sort of coined an interest. And I enjoyed working with the young people that much that when the foundry eventually closed down, after 17 years, I looked into youth work because I'd enjoyed the work there that much. And that's when I went into to become a qualified youth worker, and then built on that from there. Like you just mentioned, I did a master's degree in applied community studies. Started to do loads of work in schools and youth centres in the West Midlands, but then it sort of spread out. And I was working for years in areas like Manchester, Bradford, Leeds, certain parts of London, all over the place, really. So the demand was really there for the work that I was doing. And it just built up from there. And then I was approached by the Home Office to see if I would be prepared to do one-to-one work. They call it intervention work, with people who, should we say, are vulnerable to certain, you know, negative messages. And I did that for 10 years. I worked with about 321 individuals. And I literally retired from that last year. So okay. I'm semi-retired now, but still active, obviously, still because of the COVID situation. I'm doing a lot on Zoom and MST, you know, staff training and still work with young people in schools.
Excellent. So thank you, Dave. I know it's an evening. Even though everyone is still on semi-lockdown, it's still an evening. So thank you for your time. So if we crack on, so you know, the 4 steps of radicalization. So if we start from the very beginning.
Yeah. So I like to start this, especially when I'm doing presentations on the far right, because this is a little bit different. Because Dunia Bouzar basically is a French female Muslim academic. And she put together this, what she calls 4 steps to radicalization. And because I've been working in this field for a while, there's quite a few sort of very confusing and intricate, shall we say, different models of radicalization. You know, they're all relevant. But when I saw this one, it just drew me to it because it was quite straightforward, quite simple, self-explanatory. And she was talking at the time in 2015, she was talking about potentially young Muslim people who may get drawn into, you know, supporting things like Daesh or IS, whichever you prefer. But I read through it and I thought, hang on, and I was at the time, I'm working now with white young people who I could put to every one of those bullet points and it would be just as relevant. So the argument there is, you know, I know it's different contextually, but the argument is that people that are targeting people to try and radicalize them often use very similar methods. So that's why I like that. And particularly the last one, the bottom one, the dehumanization stage, you know, that kind of language, I haven't heard. I've been doing work around racism, as you mentioned, for just over now 30 years. And it's a sad indictment, I guess, in a way, as to where we're at, but it's true. I've actually had to dig stuff out of storage that I put into storage that I used to use in schools and youth centres about 8 or 9 years ago. And I stopped using it because I thought, well, surely we've got past that kind of level of racism. And unfortunately, it doesn't appear that we have. I don't know if anyone saw the figures. I think it was last week. I think it's in primary schools across the UK. The exclusions for racism, this is children at primary school, have gone up by around 40%. And I'll be honest, that chimes with my experience and our experience at my project. You know, we are seeing, and I have seen, you know, language, dehumanizing language about Muslim people, about black people, about Jewish people that I haven't heard for a good almost 10 years. So I think that dehumanization level is one to be worried about, to be honest. But I like that model of radicalization.
Okay. So the process of radicalization.
Yeah.
Let's drill down. Who's this young man here?
Okay. Now I'm not going to go into surnames, obviously, because of confidentiality reasons. But it's open source. You know, it was a. Well, it hit the national news at the time. His first name's Jack, and I worked with him for several months after he'd become radicalized. So I was trying to sort of de-radicalize him, if that's, you know, the case. And I like the series of pictures because when I put this up, process of radicalization, sometimes people in the groups that I'm training, you know, they'll think it's going to be a flow chart or something. It's not. It's literally just a series of pictures of this young man. So I want to just slowly work through them, and I'm hoping that people can see what I can obviously see. And it's a massive change in his demeanor, in his attitude, and just how he looks. So the first one, I always say, this is a picture of Jack before anyone messed with his head. So that's Jack just posing on Instagram, as many young people do. Yeah, and we know they do a lot worse than that. You know what I mean? That's kind of normal, whatever normal is. So if we have a look at the next slide, Jack then gets involved in the Brexit debate. Nothing wrong with that on paper, obviously. He joins the Vote Leave campaign, and that's him in the middle of a city centre up in the north. When you look at Jack there, to me, he still looks quite innocent in a way. He looks pretty lost, to be honest. He's standing quite a way away from the other three people. They've got the leaflets ready to give out. He's just got his hands hanging down like, you know, what am I doing here kind of thing. He's quite a lot younger than the other three individuals as well. But it's the person standing next to him that appears in the next slide. And this is where he started to become, you know, to change his views. So again, not going into any names for obvious reasons, but you can see by the tattoo that she's, you know, got a certain viewpoint, shall we say. And Jack admitted to me that these two people, along with a few others as well, not just them, they were a couple of the people that got into his head, and he was describing them as true patriots, the way forward for the UK, etc. And I remember saying, I hope not. I really do hope not, because I hope the way forward for the UK isn't going back to the days of the celebrating the swastika. So they got into Jack's head a little bit. And then if we look at the next slide, it shows Jack's bedroom. And I did say to him that I was a little bit disappointed that the Union flag, some people call it the Union Jack, was in the middle of some of these other far-right flags, because actually, I said, Jack, you know, to me, that's an insult to the millions of people that gave their lives fighting against fascism and Nazism. And also, that's all the people from the Commonwealth, obviously. People from the Caribbean, Jamaica and the other islands, people from India, what is now Pakistan, certain parts of Africa. You know, a lot of countries came together to fight that kind of ideology. So I said, I am a little bit confused as to why you can have that, you know, hanging up next to some of the more extreme far-right flags. So we didn't agree, obviously. Now, if you look at the next slide, I'm hoping that you can see a little bit of a change in how he's developing.
Yeah.
So that's Jack at home, dressed in his SS uniform. But it ain't the uniform that's important, really. You know, when you look at his face compared to how he looked at the first, you know, pretty innocent Instagram picture, and even on the Brexit story, you know, I reckon he looks pretty confident there, pretty sure of himself. And then the next slide shows him as well at home, looking pretty sure, you know, sure of himself, pretty confident. He's wearing a T-shirt that says British Free Corps. I said I was disappointed with him with this as well. We had a bit of a laugh about it in a way, because I said, you've got the 3 lions, that's the England football shirt. You've got the British flag and you've got an SS guard. And then the British Free Corps were prisoners of war, British prisoners of war, who switched their allegiances to the Nazis. So he described them as heroes, I described them as traitors. And that's where we differed, obviously. But then if you look at the next slide, and this is the last one that we show of Jack, and that's when he joined a group called National Action that was proscribed. That means it was banned by the Home Secretary in 2016. And you can see Jack in the middle there, probably holding the banner. He's doing a Nazi salute. I know his face is mainly covered, but look at the hatred in his eyes. You know, whoever he's directing that at, along with the other young men, you know, it looks pretty venomous to me. And Jack, sadly, is now in prison. I think he may be coming to the end of the prison sentence, because he didn't do all of the time. But he actually was given an 8-year prison sentence for making a bomb in his bedroom. So that's a young man, that in my experience, that's a young man, quite innocent to start with, became radicalized, got involved with an extreme right-wing group. And to me, he's ruined his life, you know, just the same as some of the so-called, you know, ISIS or Daesh supporters have ruined their lives by becoming involved with groups like this. To me, it can only do damage to individuals and families. There's never any good that can come of this. One thing I always point out as well, when you look at the ages of the people there, you can't see the faces very well, but they're all pretty young. You know, I'd guess they're all 20, 21, if not younger. So my point being there are some very young people who are sadly, you know, now becoming radicalized to the point where they're joining extremist groups.
Yeah, so quick question. So what you've done there is traced the slow drip, right? So it wasn't an overnight thing. It wasn't, you know, something that happened over weeks. It was slowly but surely that drip of radicalization happened.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. So leads us on to pathways then. So one of the things, if we look at, and I'm sure like yourself, radicalization is not binary, or anything, any type of grooming, it's not binary. So if we look at some of the pathways, we'll break them down. So a cognitive opening, what do you mean by that?
So, okay, so a cognitive opening to us, I know there's different sort of translations of it, but to us, it's when one thing can happen in an individual's life. He or she may have had certain views before, but never thought of acting upon them. Cognitive opening is when something can happen and that literally just tips the balance. You know what I mean? That's that kind of call to action, and okay, I now have to do something about this. So what happened to Adam, I'll try and keep it short because of the time. But this was an actual case that I worked on. He'd never been involved in any groups whatsoever before. He used to go to the football and supported his local team. But his brother was bullied by 3 Muslim pupils at school. Adam's white, his brother's white. And it got really bad. It went on and went on. School didn't deal with it adequately. And it got to the point where 2 of the Muslim lads, 3 of them chased him down a corridor. 2 of them had got Stanley knives, and they sliced, the intention was, we believe, to cut his blazer off his back. But because they were Stanley knives, which is a carpet knife, obviously, straight through his blazer, straight through his shirt, and straight through his skin. He ended up with, you know, several stitches in his back. His mom, who's a teacher at another school in the area, went to complain. Some people were waiting for her as she came out of the complaining meeting, and she was attacked in the street with a lump hammer. So Adam's just sitting in this place with me. I used to meet him in a McDonald's, and he just says, "I hate all Muslims." And I had to get him thinking through it by saying, well, hang on, mate, how many people attacked your brother? How many people attacked your mom? And he ended up saying 4. And I said, yeah, that's 4. You just said to me you hate all Muslims. So he'd gone into that sort of blanket, you know, that blanket blame thing for blaming a whole community or communities for what 4 individuals have done. So obviously I talked him through it, but basically what he'd been doing, he'd been going to EDL, English Defence League demos. Nothing wrong with that on paper. It's not against the law, but he'd been buying knives and knuckle dusters online and giving them out to members at the demonstration. So basically he was advocating violence. So got him all the way through that. He stopped going to these kind of things. And I said, you know, I can totally understand your frustration, your anger, but I can assure you that what you're getting involved in isn't going to help in any way. And it didn't, obviously, because he was arrested. So that was Adam's story. But then the next one, if we look at the next one, this was probably the worst one that I ever worked with. And I worked, like I said, I worked with about 321 people. And I never met this little girl. I haven't put her name, obviously, because of and I have changed some of the other names for obvious reasons. But this was a 4-year-old girl who was in a nursery, and just randomly, she drew on an A4 sheet of paper, she drew a Ku Klux Klan lynching of a black person. And that, I saw the actual picture, the police showed me it, and it shocked me, to be honest. You know, I've been doing this for years, and I've been soaking up a lot of this hatred, and I am in a very diverse family myself, shall we put it like that. And I'll get used to it, you know, I've got a thick skin. But this one bothered me simply because of the age of the little girl. So if I describe it, if you people know what stick men are, stick figures, matchstick men, we used to call them. So there was a matchstick figure being hung from a tree. She'd coloured the face in black with a black crayon. That's her depiction of a black person being lynched. Over the other side of the sheet, there were 3 other stick figures, but you couldn't see their faces because they were wearing hoods. So that's a 4-year-old girl's depiction of a Klan lynching. And I was just gobsmacked. I couldn't believe it. But it was traced back round, and basically, without going into all of the details, both parents were involved in right-wing activity, to the point where they'd even taken the 4-year-old girl, along with siblings, onto street demonstrations, doing Nazi salutes and so on. So, you know, I said to the police at the time, I can only think, where does a 4-year-old girl see a picture of a Klan lynching? You know, she must have seen the image, you know, she must have seen it somewhere. And apparently she had. But then I never got to work with that family in the end. Something else happened and there were arrests made and so on. So that one fell through, but it's always stuck in my mind about the 4-year-old girl.
Yeah, so learned behaviour.
Learned behaviour, yeah.
From an early age, okay. So so just to go back a little bit, you said when you work with, so you work with him as kind of like a mentor also as an intervention to try and dissuade.
Right. In a way, you're just there to listen. And I have had several of the people I've worked with, and I was going to say guys, but they haven't all been guys. Most of them have. There's only ever worked with two females out of the 300 and odd people. So it's very male orientated, shall we say. But I used to have a lot of them say, if I hadn't got you to sort of offload to and rant to, because some of them did, you know, then I don't know what I'd have done. You know, I wouldn't have been in a good position. So sometimes it is, you know, someone for them to have a rant at, have a moan at, get it off the chest, as it were. But I would rather them sit with me in an office somewhere or in a McDonald's or anywhere. I've sat in loads of weird places. You know, I'd rather them rant to me than to try and go out into the, you know, into the wider public and take it out on somebody else. You know what I mean?
Excellent. So Simon.
Yeah, I've changed this name. Simon, historical abuse. And I've worked with people who have been abused physically, mentally, emotionally, even sexually, you know, and that can lead to a lot of anger, frustration, and, you know, they want somebody to take it out on. So Simon basically was from early teens. He was physically and emotionally and psychologically abused by his dad. His dad hung a belt up in the bedroom where Simon shared with his brother. And most nights, not every night, but most nights, he would slowly walk across the bedroom, take the belt down and lash Simon and his brother. They had to bend down over the bed. He would lash them and they would have to keep repeating racist slogans. So Simon literally grew up having his words to me. He said, well, what chance had I got of being a well-rounded individual? He said, because I've gone through this for years. So he was just looking for fights all the time. You know, he was picking fights all the time and getting arrested for it. But again, you know, he moved on. He got married later, and he stopped. You know, he stopped getting arrested, stopped his kind of behaviour. But in a way, you know, when you look at the 4-year-old girl and then you look at that abuse of Simon, before I started doing this, I would have had the view like, you know, well, they're racist. You know, we can't be engaging with them. Due to these interventions, I've had to do a U-turn. I've had to do a kind of what the government often tend to do, because literally, you know, in a way, yes, people have got racist views. Some of it's learned, some of it's not. But in some cases, not all by any means, but in some cases, they're victims themselves in a different context. Because I don't know how we could describe that 4-year-old girl as not being a victim. I think she is. And potentially Simon as well, obviously. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, it opened my eyes a little bit, shall we say?
Yeah, and this is the thing that we always have to revisit. You know, influence, grooming. You know, and sometimes it becomes a culture. That's how much it happens. So this isn't. I mean, in this kind of era where everything's online, and one of the biggest concerns most people have had over the lockdown is the access to young people, consistently being online, accessing websites, accessing not just, you know, not more than memes. Was this one of your first? Was this what made this Paul and Alan situation different?
Well, what made that a little bit different, and this can get a bit contentious, but it's actually true. Both of these two are young men, and they are on the autistic spectrum. And I'm only saying it can get contentious because in the past, you know, I've had people say, oh, hang on, are you saying that somebody's on the spectrum, so they're going to get involved in the far right? No, of course I'm not. Not by any means. But there's a vulnerability there that can be exploited. And that needn't be the far right. That we've got evidence as well of young Muslim people who have joined ISIS that are actually on the autistic spectrum as well. One of the issues of that condition, and it's not always there, but it can be fixation. Some people describe it as obsession. I don't like the word obsession. I don't think they're obsessed. It's a bit heavy, but definitely fixation. So these are two young men. I could have added another 20 names there probably. they become fixated on certain websites, you know, certain bloggers, and so on, and they're soaking up, or, you know, the term echo chamber. You know, and there can be there is a right-wing echo chamber. I'm very well aware there's a left-wing echo chamber as well. You know, there's several different ones. But if you become fixated and that's all you're accessing all the time, that's all you hear, that's all you know. I've had guys say to me, I've never heard, you know, a counter-narrative, you know, a different viewpoint. I've never heard it. So in a way, the online influence is absolutely huge. You may have seen, I don't know if people saw this, there was a Panorama documentary about 2 weeks ago. I think you can still get it on Catch Up. And they found out there's an American group called The Base, and they're actually, and they found out that they were definitely targeting young people in the UK and in other countries, but in the UK specifically. And one of them was he was 15 when they radicalised him. This was somewhere up north. And he was arrested then for sort of plots, you know, terror plots and so on. But these, you know, the online influence by people who are literally targeting people and grooming them online is probably the biggest threat that we've got at the moment. You know?
Yeah, I mean, we know, you know, the tragic situation about the young girls in East London, that it was, you know, they didn't get radicalised in a mosque or in a talk. Right. You know, they got radicalised online from their bedrooms.
Yeah, they did, yeah.
You know?
They did. They never even met. It was a female ISIS recruit, I believe, that radicalised them. So, and then in the news last week, there was, I think, the Home Secretary, she's looking to ban, because there's several of these the groups that are now prescribed. There's the National Action I mentioned. There's one called the Son and Craig Division. They've been prescribed, a couple of others. But she's also trying to prescribe one called the Fuhr Craig Division. And research has now shown that the commander, he called himself the commander of the Fuhr Craig Division is in Estonia, and he's 13 years old. 13, so the commander of a group that's ended up, you know, some of them have got arms caches and terror plots. The commander is 13 years old. So you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, just to backtrack a little, for those tuned in, those listeners tuned in who may not be up to speed with some of the language that we use. So what's a prescribed group? Can you explain that?
Yeah, prescribed is when it's deemed to be a terrorist organisation. So basically, it's been banned. So to even show support for that group, let alone be a member of the group, you can end up in prison. So that's what happened with National Action. Several of the young people, again, mainly young people that have been arrested and some imprisoned for National Action, they've just been found to be, you know, guilty of being members or showing support for that group. So that's when it becomes a banned group in the UK.
Okay.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's important that parents, carers, practitioners understand this, because and it evolves, right? The list goes up. It changes. It's not. It's not static. Okay.
Oh, it's far from static. Even some of the groups that I'm going to talk about in a minute have virtually disappeared now. So yeah.
Okay. So it's a move. So radicalisation and the groups associated can be a moving part.
It is. It's very much a moving part. And I'll be honest, people can sort of cherry pick, as they say, you know, between the different groups and the different ideological beliefs, because, you know, it's too simplistic to just say somebody's racist. You know, that could there's so many different levels of being racist, you know, but they pick from certain parts of the different ideologies.
Okay, excellent.
So it's not static, as you say.
Yeah, very well explained. So this frustration and anger, I'm sure I don't know where this is going to go, but elaborate on it.
Okay, what frustration and anger is? So Ivan, I think you know who Ivan is actually. Ivan's an ex-CDL regional organizer, and he left the movement, does a lot of work now. He works actually with me in New Education that you mentioned at the start. And Ivan says, and I believe him, you know, I've sat with a lot of people in some areas like Rochdale and Rotherham and other areas. We could mention Telford. So some of the grooming gangs, and it has happened, you know, I'm not one of these people who wants to pretend it hasn't, because it has. They're really angry and they're frustrated. They feel like the authorities, for whatever reason, haven't dealt with it properly. Sometimes that's true, maybe not always, but it has been true in the past. And their anger and frustration can easily be harnessed by people to, you know, to achieve their own ends, as it were. So that's what Ivan's point is. He said, you know, it's not all racism, and it's not. Some of it can be easily led into that, but it doesn't all start off as being you know, outright racism towards whoever. People's anger and frustration can be exploited, just how I said about the, you know, people with Asperger's, autism can also be exploited.
Yeah, so and it's interesting. I mean, in substance misuse, they call it a gateway drug, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's very similar when people get involved in gangs or get involved in extremism. You know, there's gateway drugs towards that. It's not, once again, it's not an overnight thing.
No.
Yeah. So sense of loss. We finish with Andy.
Sense of loss. So Andy used to be a BNP organizer for some years. And I can empathise with this a bit, to be fair, because he says, he talks about a sense of loss from he'll term it the white working class community. Now, the only sort of precursor I'll put with that, it's probably a very long time since the working class has been solely white. You know, there were black people here in the Edwardian days and the Georgian days and the Tudor days. We can track all that history. So I would say the working class, it doesn't, you know, necessarily have to be solely white. But what Andy means is a lot of the things that I grew up with, you know, going to the football, a lot of young people now can't afford that. A lot of the pubs have closed down for whatever reasons on estates. That the pub used to be the focal point of a working class estate. You know, I worked, as I said, in a foundry for 17 years. There's no, or very little, heavy industry left, like, you know, mining, shipbuilding, steel erecting. You know what I mean? A lot has been lost from those communities.
So what's referred to kind of like the unskilled labour workforce, what communities would rely on. Yeah.
That's right. So when one place closes down, that's why there's a, rightly so, you know, there's a big uproar in some areas like Sunderland, you know, where they got the car plants. You know, if that car plant closes down, most of that community are out of work. Do you know what I mean? So I can sympathise with that and empathise with that. But again, that's something that sometimes can be exploited. So Andy's had examples of a pub closed down on the one estate near where he lives. And there was a whole kind of leafleting campaign. It's a few years ago. And it said that the pub had closed down because the Muslims, in quote unquote, had complained to the local council. Well, that was never true. The pub closed down because the brewery had gone bankrupt. Do you see what I mean? But people get this leaflet and it's like, bloody hell, look at that. The pub's closed down because the Muslims have complained. No one did complain. So again, it's something that can be exploited.
Yes, I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. Okay,
and then
so there's no typical... Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I've just put that at the bottom. There's no typical, in my experience, there's no such thing as a typical far-right individual. You could probably say there's no such thing as a typical ISIS individual. You know, literally everyone has a story. That's not condoning it, but I'm trying to, I've had through the years, I've had to try and understand it, as opposed to just say, you know, these people have got these views, can't be working with them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and if you don't understand it, how can you offer a counter narrative, right?
Exactly. You can't. Exactly. That's the point, mate. That is the point. So this slide here is just, it's probably the worst looking boy band in history. But I've worked on several of these cases. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I think everyone on there would be what you would have to describe as, this is not kind of EDL, this is not even Britain First, not BNP. This is more out to the, you know, the more extreme elements of the right wing. So here you're talking about National Action, Aryan Strike Force, Son and Craig Division, a couple of others as well. You've got some of the international ones like Anders Breivik, who that's him in his court appearance, still doing a Nazi salute, so he's got no remorse. The one I wanted to point out, there's two young men there across the left of the screen, just one up from the very bottom. And again, I won't go into details of, because I've actually worked with about 9 people on there. But those two young men, they were members of the Son and Craig division. And some of the stuff that they were coming out with, even in court, you know, it was absolutely horrific. It wasn't just racism. You know, they're talking about child abuse, they're talking about paedophilia. There's some pretty nasty stuff nowadays that's getting mixed in along with, you know, the racist viewpoint, shall we say. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Yeah?
Totally. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not going to spend too long on this, but it's just to explain to people that this is the kind of new police definitions. I used to have a split screen, and it would have been one side to the left, one to the right. One side would have been far right, and the other one would have been extreme right. Now, the police, and I agree with them broadly, they've come up with these 3 different definitions. So if we can go to the next slide, and I'll explain each one. So what's the difference? Okay, next slide. So it's a bit wordy, and I won't go through all of it. But cultural nationalism, this is how we interpret it. It's not necessarily about people's skin color or the color of people's skin. It's very anti-Islam. That's why you've got groups such as the EDL and Britain First, but they don't talk about people's skin color. So that's why some of these groups would say, you know, we're not racist. And I've been on some of the demonstrations, and I have met people who I wouldn't even class myself, you know, I wouldn't describe them necessarily as being racist. But very anti-Islam. It's all this, so, you know, we're losing our culture. We're going to be taken over. There's going to be a mosque on every corner in 20 years' time. It's that kind of nationalism. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then if we look at the next one, this is where it does definitely start to move across into attitudes towards people's skin color. As the title suggests, white nationalism. They talk a lot about the white race. They talk a lot about, they advocate some kind of white homeland. Talk about getting repatriation, if necessary, forced. So some of these groups would be the ones on the bottom. The yellow logo is the Generation Identity, or the Identitarian movement. That's in a flux at the moment, to be honest. It's virtually in meltdown in some parts of Europe. It didn't start in the UK. It came to the UK. For a brief period, there was a Generation Identity UK. I believe that that's now defunct. It is active in other parts of Europe, but also in a state of flux. The hand next to it is a group called the 100 Handers. And their main kind of MO, they do what they call stickering campaigns. So basically they'll turn up somewhere, probably late at night, and flood the place with stickers. So some of their stickers would say, classic one of theirs says, multiculturalism is white genocide. Another one said, it's okay to be white. So it's this kind of, you know, they are linking into this kind of differentiation, so-called, between the so-called races. I've never believed in. A lot of my early work, still do it now. We always challenge the concept of race itself, because my argument is that race is socially constructed. A lot of people talk about this now, but I honestly do believe that it is. We used to do long sessions where we showed people, even the people that created this thing that we call race, because it hasn't been around for millions of years. It's only been around for the last few hundred years. So it's kind of in a timeline, it's kind of quite recent in a way. So we always challenge it. I've done DNA tests with people. that are massively anti-Semitic, and they've suddenly found out that their main genetic ancestry is Ashkenazi Jew. So it's a way of challenging that kind of that kind of us and them thinking.
Yeah.
So that's white nationalism. And if we go to the next one, and this has probably been around the longest, so white supremacy or white supremacism, and obviously that's pretty, it explains itself basically. So it's this thought that the white race, in inverted commas, is superior. Nowadays, you can get people bringing in sort of, like it says on there, quasi-religious terms, stuff around the Aryan soul, occult philosophies. There's groups called the Order of Nine Angles. There's some pretty weird and wonderful stuff out there that gets kind of wrapped up with white supremacy per se. What you may notice at the bottom, where you've got extremist groups and terrorism examples, there's more of these than there are with the other two types, cultural nationalism, white nationalism. So that kind of suggests if you're radicalized into white supremacy, the evidence shows here and elsewhere that there's more likelihood of you becoming involved in terrorism, as opposed to just, going on a demonstration or, other quite legitimate ways maybe of making your voice heard or trying to. Yeah. So that's a dangerous one, obviously. I have seen, like I said at the start, I have seen an increase in that kind of attitude, especially from some of the younger people that I've worked with. So that is of concern, shall we say. But then I think the next slide shows potentially what is the biggest threat. Sorry, these are a few of their logos. Go into the next slide. I think it goes to lone actor. Yeah. So, okay. Sorry, if you go back to the lone actor. Yeah. So, no, go back one, Ray. Sorry. That's it. Yeah. Right-wing lone actor. And that's a right-wing one, obviously, but that could just the same be an ISIS one. So a lone actor is somebody that the security forces aren't necessarily aware of, doesn't go on demonstrations, doesn't come out with a load of, extreme, shall we say, comments online, keeps themselves to themselves, and then one day they decide that it's time to do something and they get up and do it. So that, in a way, I think that's probably the most dangerous, because how do we know they're there? I think an example of that, arguably, could be the guy that killed Jo Cox, the Labour MP. He knew she was in a meeting in a library. He waited till she came out. He shot her 3 times and he stabbed her 15 times. That was simply because he didn't agree with her politics. And, there's a lot I don't agree with now. I'd struggle to agree with anything these days, but, I don't want to hurt anyone. I certainly don't want to kill anyone because of it. But the point being, they didn't know that this guy was around. So that's a real threat. That's somebody that's, the term under the radar.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay.
So these 14 words.
Yeah. This is what we call a central tenet behind the extreme right-wing ideology. And again, this is not EDL. This is the more extreme elements. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. So it is literally 14 words. This is a central belief system for a white supremacist, because of what it says. They only want to preserve a future for white children. If we go to the next slide, you'll see who coined the phrase. A guy called David Lane. Been dead for some years now, actually. He was an American white supremacist with links to the Klan and other extreme groups in the US. I often say to people, what does a white supremacist look like? Because they're not all skinheads with a swastika in the middle of the forehead. I used to do loads of sessions around the early skinhead movement, which I was a part of in the late 60s. And that, although there were obviously racist skinheads then, the skinhead movement was not based initially on racism. Arguably, it was the first youth fashion or cult that welcomed and embraced people from a different background. Because before that, I don't think any of them did. So skinheads, to me, which I remember, was kind of a fusion between white working class youth and mainly Jamaican youth, you know, the rude boy culture. There's a film on TV at the moment called Rude Boy, the history of Trojan records. And that's what I remember, you know, that. So I always challenge that. But when you look at this guy, you know, a lot of people wouldn't have him down as a white supremacist. The necklace is a bit of a giveaway. That's Thor's hammer hanging upside down. So some of these guys do really like the sort of kind of Nordic, sometimes Celtic, you know, symbolism, particularly Nordic and sort of Norse mythology and so on. But he came up with the 14 words. The next slide shows where he coined the phrase from. Chapter 8, Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler. Won't go into it all now. Don't expect people to read all of it, but the first few lines, he's kind of summarized that and come up with the 14 words. And then the next slide.
And as important, people, please don't download it. You know.
No, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
It's a big seller now. Apparently, you can get it on Amazon along with a lot of other stuff. But there you go.
Please, yeah. You know, but you got to be careful, haven't you, online what you search.
You have got to be careful. Yeah. So the next book, when I said the 14 words was a central tenet, so is this, the Turner Diaries, written in as far back as 1978 by William Pierce under the pseudonym of Andrew MacDonald. Direct influence on the three people there. So Davy Copeland was the London nail bomber. Timothy McVeigh was the Oklahoma bomber. Anders Breivik did the Utøya Island attacks. In fact, Timothy McVeigh had got some pages of that book ripped out and stuck in his pocket as he carried out the attack, because he virtually tried to copy part of that book. So basically, it's a fictional account, and it's a group that take up arms against the state. And if you look at the next slide, this is an even more recent book, and it's called Siege, much more recent, 1992. And this advocates murder, as it says, extreme violence to try and destabilize the system and create chaos, because they like to think if they could create chaos and anarchy, then they would have more of a chance, maybe, you know, of getting involved and getting some kind of power. So some of the younger people that I've worked with, they've all read the Turner Diaries, but a lot of the younger guys would say, yeah, but that's okay, but now I'm reading Siege. Okay, so the next slide shows a little bit of an evolution. And if you just keep clicking through, Ray, you'll see, yeah, there you go. And then you stop at that one. So we've had the National Front, we've had Combat 18, links to Blood and Honor. The one in the middle isn't a well-known one, but it stands for the Aryan Strike Force. So two of the people on the picture I showed you earlier of all the faces, I've worked directly with two ex-members of that. The next logo is National Action, and the bottom one, the yellow one, is Generation Identity. So we've almost had an evolution, but all I'd say is the one at the bottom, the Generation Identity, although they're in some kind of meltdown, a lot of those young people are intelligent, they're quite fashionable, you know, people have described some of them as hipsters. They're quite clever, they're quite academic. I've worked with people who have been doing philosophy degrees. I've had some very deep philosophical debates with some of these guys. Generally, you wouldn't have probably had that with the National Front, which was a very working class group or groups. So I think we need to be aware that the far right is actually changing. You know, there's some changes that are happening now. There's some more to come in the future, I believe. And it's just being aware that you know, the old sort of stereotype of the National Front skinhead, I'm not saying they're not there, but they're you're much more likely to walk past somebody in the middle of Tesco's or somewhere who's quite well dressed, you know, casually dressed, but looking smart, with extreme right-wing views. You literally you don't know who's who anymore. So it's changing, shall we say? Shall we put it like that? Okay. So the next slide, this shows, I mentioned him earlier. This is the guy who walked into the mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, live streamed it as he was killing people. But if you look at his hand, his cuff there, that's his first court appearance. If you look at his hand, he's making a certain sign. And we've all got the same sign on our phones. Basically, there's a little emoji, and it used to be okay. He's having to do it holding his hand down because he's in handcuffs, obviously. If he wasn't, he'd put his hand up. So it's like the okay sign. But mainly in America, it's come from, and they're using that now as a white power sign, because they're saying that the three fingers sticking up in the air and then the thumb and the forefinger put together spell out WP. WP standing for white power. So that's him in his first court appearance, literally, I would argue, showing no remorse. That's him, you know, suggesting to his followers on the outside that he still believes in what he did. And the next slide just shows how some of these groups, whether they mean to or not, can have a direct influence. The left side of the screen shows a general, you can see at the bottom, identitarian movement. Their logo's on there. One of their quotes is that, stop the great replacement. So their argument is that eventually there will be no white Europeans left in Europe. That's what the great replacement theory is. On the right side of the screen is the so-called manifesto of the Christchurch attacker, the mosque attacker. What's he called it? The great replacement. So I would argue there's a little bit of a suggestion that the one group had an influence on, you know, a terrorist attack. Also, the guy that did the Christchurch attacks donated a reasonably large amount of money directly to that group, or the leader at the time of that group. So I think it'd be hard to argue that there's no influence whatsoever. Yeah. Okay. And we're coming towards the end of it now, really, for 6 or 7 minutes. These are just, I don't expect people to read all of this, but it's just the point to make. This is only last year, and these are in the US, and these are very young men who are literally taking up arms. This guy went into a Walmart in Texas, and he shot dead 22 people, injured another 24. And if you read through it, he's using the words of invasion, I'm defending my country, there's an ethnic replacement happening. He goes on at the bottom to talk about race mixing, and he suggests that the best solution would be to divide America into territories with at least one for each race. And going back to my earlier point, you know, where do some people go? You know, how on earth can you divide a country or a continent into sections for each race? It's a farcical argument. It can never happen, but that's what he believes. But, you know, as ridiculous as some of the views may be, this guy's killed 22 people. So we can't discount it. The next one wasn't even a political rally or a meeting or anything that this guy attacked. It was a food festival. Again, last summer, roughly a year ago, he went to a food festival. He killed 4 people, injured 11 others. But look at the age of the guy. These are young guys. He quoted from this book on the left. It's called Might is Right. And it's anti-Semitic, it's sexist, it's white supremacist language. It condemns intermarriage between so-called races and defends violence based on eugenics. And we know what happened with eugenics and where that ended up. But my point being, these are young guys who are taking up arms and killing people based on, in his case, based on a book, partly, that was written as far back as 1896. Okay, and then the next slide is another worrying one. And if you click again, right, it should show, it'll, yeah, just keep clicking till it comes up. So the Incel movement is, that's it, cool. The Incel movement stands for, the top line there, involuntarily celibate. So basically, these are young men, and they're not in a sexual relationship with anyone, and they're angry, they're frustrated, and they formed a kind of an online group or community. Very misogynistic, so it's pretty women hating, shall we say. It advocates violence and rape, and at times murder. And a growing number, it says here some, it is some, but it's a growing number that we are seeing of incel individuals are also using white supremacy language in their posts. Up to this point, and this was a few months ago, I put this together, there have been 45 murders in North America committed by incel followers. The SPLC, which is the Southern Poverty Law Centre, they monitor hate groups in the UK. They've designated the incel movement now as a hate group. And the next slide just gives two quick examples of how it can play out. The guy on the right, he was in the German city of Hanau. He walked into 2 shisha cafes and he shot dead 9 people. And he lived with his mom. And then after he'd killed the 9 people who were all Muslim, he walks home, he kills his mom, and then he kills himself. He self-identified as an incel, but he also called for, his words, non-whites to be killed. So there's a recent example. That was last year. And a few years earlier, not that long ago, the guy in Toronto, he said he was radicalized online by incels. So you have got people joining this movement who are actually prepared to go out again and commit murder. So, we need to be aware of it. There was some research done last year by some experts in the field, and apparently they reckon that there's up to 1,000 incel supporters or members active in the UK currently. So that's one to be, it's not directly right-wing, but a growing number of them are slipping into that kind of, right-wing plus attitude. Okay, so that's enough about incel, I think. We just got a couple of minutes. I want to mention a couple of books. This was written as far back as 1942. Ashley Montague. This is the 6th edition now. Still available. Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race. That's a good read. That kind of debunks the myth of race. The next slide shows Deborah Lipstadt's book, Anti-Semitism. That's just a kind of a warning that actually anti-Semitism is on the rise, and it certainly is. And the next slide gives an example of it. And this was in North London. And people here, whoever did this graffiti, they've put the Star of David and they've put 9/11. Now, when we think of 9/11, if I was delivering this to a live group audience, in a lecture theatre, and I often used to say, what do they mean by 9/11? And virtually everyone says Twin Towers, because that's what we refer to now. 9/11 has become synonymous with the Twin Towers. Being honest, when I saw this, I didn't think of the Twin Towers. I checked it out with a guy I know very well who used to be very active in some extreme right-wing groups, and he agreed with my kind of take on it. I said, mate, I don't think it's the Twin Towers. And he laughed and he said, neither do I. I think this refers to a night in Germany called Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht in German means the night of broken glass. And it took place, it happened over 2 or 3 nights, but the first night was the 9th of November, 1938. And that's when, in Germany, synagogues were burned to the floor, meat shops, kosher meat shops, Jewish businesses were attacked. So I think that whoever did this in North London, literally a few months ago in December 2019, that's almost like a threat to the Jewish communities in that area. That's almost like saying, look, Kristallnacht, we can do it again. And at the time, we were quite amused because Sky News, BBC, they all reported it as being the conspiracy theory around 9/11. And, it was really the Jews that planned it and this kind of stuff. I've had people say to me, didn't you know, Dave, on the day of the Twin Towers, all Jews took the day off work? Really? Well, how did they know? These are crazy theories. But I think that is more of a direct threat to the Jewish community in North London. Okay. Next one shows the synagogue attack. That's the guy on the right that did it. this again is just last year. He made some homemade guns. Luckily, they jammed repeatedly. He actually 3D printed them. 3D printer. But that's the comment that he was making in his car on the bottom, talking about feminism, immigration. The root of all these problems is the Jew. So there's your anti-Semitism. So what he did, tried to get into a synagogue, couldn't get in, walked around the back or the side to try and get in the back way. There was a Jewish lady laying some flowers on a grave. He killed her. Then he went to a halal meat shop, presuming that it would be run by Muslims, which it was. I think they were Turkish people, and he shot dead one of the workers in the shop. So there's another example, literally from last year. And then the next slide shows something from this year. And this actually surprised me. I was surprised. I don't know if you can still get them now because we're in July, but definitely in January this year, you could buy these books that were originally written in German in the late 1930s, referring to Jews as race defilers and devils, calling for the killing of Jews. You could get both of those books in January this year on Amazon, translated into English. And that just shocked me. You know, who's going to buy the kids these books? But some people will. I've worked directly with some people who would. Okay, and then the last couple of slides. This is a new book that's out at the moment. Angela Saini is a BBC science correspondent. It's called Superior, The Return of Race Science. So basically, she's saying more or less what I was saying, that kind of race thinking and the whole argument around intelligence and morality solely based on skin color is actually coming back. And when I said earlier, you know, I'm hearing stuff now that I haven't heard for almost 10 years, I would agree with what she's saying in that book. And then the last one, I'll leave you that slide really. This is Adam Rutherford. He's a geneticist, written this year. And there he looks at race and reality, history and science. So basically, I mean, it's a twee statement in a way, how to argue with a racist, but basically it gives you arguments in there, including how to use DNA as a direct challenge to any racist view of any way around. So I think because of the time, we've gone to 8:05. Yeah. Shall we leave it there, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just a couple of things to round up.
Yeah.
So I've been getting some questions on the different platforms. Okay. But I think you've also semi-answered some of them with directing to those books. I think what you've shared with us today, Dave, has been very valuable because of the current climate, because of, you know, we've seen what's happened over the last 3 months, especially around what happened in the US and then over here, conversations around racial justice. And also the perception that every person is racist in the same way, if that makes sense. But also what I've really found valuable today is that you've been, I don't know if fair is the right word, but you've made it clear that racism and extremism is in all cultures and in all faiths. You know, and you've the intersectionality of how there's so many things in common when people are put down the pathway to radicalization. Can I? Because what I want to do, I want to move forward. I just want people to get hold of you. If you've got any questions for Dave, there's his details. Drop him an email. Because people are asking individual questions around, for example, you know, a lot of the people that are on the marches, what ideology they follow. And I think you mentioned that earlier on in your presentation. It's a Tuesday evening, and it's just 5 minutes past 8. I'm going to thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Please, people, take this in. It will be uploaded onto our platforms, and forward it to people. But also, it shows you the conversation that extremism is not in one specific community. It's not. It doesn't have. It's not binary, and the pathway to it aren't binary either. So, Dave, have a blessed evening. Thank you all for signing, and hopefully we'll see you in due course.
Sound. Thank you, mate. Thanks for having me there. Thank you, Ray. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks for tuning in, everyone. Power to the peaceful.
Thank you, mate. All of it.